Hello and welcome to a new episode of the It's Not That Simple podcast from the Francisco Manuel dos Santos Foundation. It's a pleasure to have you on board for a conversation that I anticipate will be absolutely fascinating. Today's topic is adolescence, and we're going to be discussing it with an expert, Dr. Lisa Damour, a clinical psychologist, author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, Untangled, Under Pressure, and the Emotional Lives of Teenagers. She co-hosts the Ask Lisa podcast, works in collaboration with UNICEF, and serves as a senior advisor to the Schubert Center for Child Services at Case Western Reserve University as well. Lisa, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. This is a topic that obviously is so pertinent to anyone who has been or will be a parent as well. Adolescence. To set the scene for us, please, I wanted you to really break down on what it's like to be a teenager in the Western world these days, and really why it's not that simple at all.
Well, I'm honored to be with you. Thank you so much for having me join you. And of course, anyone who wants to talk about teenagers, I am thrilled to have this conversation because it's such an important topic and one that it hits so close to home for so many of us. So it has never been easy to be a teenager. We remember this ourselves when we think back about our own adolescent years, and that is still true. But what I can say now is that there are many more complexities that surround teenagers than when we were growing up. And I think probably the best way to summarize this is to say that teenagers are dealing with much more input these days, and also they have expectations of much more output these days. So compared to when we were teenagers, of course, our teenagers are living in a digital environment. They have access all day, every day to a huge range of peers, a huge number of headlines, social media, all that comes with it. So they are working to take in, and I would say even metabolize, so much more information than we ever were. And then on top of that, what we ask of teenagers is more, certainly in the US, but I think not just here. When I think about what the expectations are about what they will accomplish in high school, or what the expectations are for what they're going to say on their college applications if they are applying to college, it is so much more than was asked of me as a teenager, probably asked of you as a teenager. And so the demands on them, we're sort of getting them coming and going. And all of this is layered on top of the fact that being a teenager is a time of enormous change, and that by its nature, change brings about stress. So our teenagers are dealing with a huge amount.
It's interesting because I've heard you say that if you put a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old side to side, right, the same person, and you look at them, they don't look like they're from the same species, right? So much change has happened in those years. And then you have all this noise that is present in teenager societies, like you said, because of technology, because of social media. So the conflicts are daily, right? Internal conflicts, external conflicts, and then trying to figure out who you are in the middle of all this noise.
Yeah, no, it's a huge amount. And it can feel overwhelming to think about. It can definitely feel overwhelming for the teenager and for the adults around the teenager. But I do want to actually, early in this conversation, bring in some hope and some direction so that we don't feel overwhelmed by thinking about teenagers or trying to raise them. And what I want people to know is that we have studied adolescence for a very long time. And we know that the single most powerful force for adolescent mental health is strong relationships with caring adults. So as much as there's a lot going on around teenagers, the adults in their environment have real power to support them, to cultivate their mental health, to protect their mental health. And so I don't want anyone to come out of this conversation feeling overwhelmed and helpless about what it means to be or raise a teenager right now.
Of course, and hopefully you'll definitely help in that aspect. Let's break down the main causes of anxiety that you have identified in the extensive work that you've done as a professional and in the books that you've written as well. How would you pinpoint those? What are the main challenges that teenagers are facing specifically?
So we can break it down a little bit developmentally. So early in adolescence, what is happening is that if everything is going as it should, teenagers are loosening their ties a bit to family at home and strengthening their ties to peers. This is what we expect to see. This can be very anxiety provoking. As they loosen their ties at home, they become very anxious about who they're going to be with. Will they have friends? Will they have enough friends? Will they have a strong sense of belonging? Will they feel included? So early in adolescence, I would say around 12, 13, that's really what's top of mind. And then once that's resolved, and hopefully it gets resolved pretty readily, teenagers often start to think about, what's the future hold for me? What am I going to do with myself? What am I about? And get anxious about performing in the ways that we ask them to, either academically or in terms of their vocational interests. But we do, as teenagers become 13, 14, 15, start to impress upon them the importance of thinking ahead and making choices and then putting out good work and learning how to do good work. I think as teenagers move into later adolescence, they can have bigger, broader questions about, how am I going to make my mark on the world? How am I going to navigate a world that is changing really fast around me? And also, how do I navigate big, overwhelming threats that are certainly we're all facing, but teenagers, it means something different to them, such as climate crisis or global wars, or, certainly in the US, teenagers worry a lot about guns and gun violence. So their world opens up, and with that comes both opportunity, but also a broader awareness of how many challenges they are inheriting from us.
It's interesting you mentioned the violence aspect and the gun aspect. I know personally various families who have actually left the United States because they just couldn't handle with their kids going through gun drills at school, right? And you can't imagine adding that to everything else that's already going on. Flipping this for the parents, what are the anxieties that parents are having trying to deal with these teenagers in a completely different environment? And you said earlier that it's perhaps tougher for them these days than it was in my time or your time. I was born in 1975. I'd like to say that I was exposed to information from my parents, from my school teachers, and from my classmates and friends, but that was pretty much it. I wasn't bombarded with everything else that's going on and all these pressures. And you mentioned the friends, and then there's the followers, and then there's the engagement, and then there's the likes. And what are parents trying to do to be able to adapt to this? Because it's certainly something that I think about for my future, trying to deal with in the future with a teenage girl, how to deal with them in such a different, modern, digital environment.
It really is different. So in terms of what parents worry about, I think you hit the nail on the head. Parents worry a lot about social media and its impact on their teenagers. And they're given good reason by the media. There are near daily headlines about how harmful social media can be for teenagers. The truth is, it's a pretty complex story, right? It's not that simple, as you would say.
Yeah.
That we have research showing that social media can be helpful to kids and enhance their lives. We have some research showing that it can do harm and undermine their overall mental health. We have some research that comes up with a neutral finding. And what is really happening is that there's not a kid on the planet for whom social media is not simultaneously a positive and negative experience. And so we get very confusing research findings. What I would say to parents who are anxious about this is do everything you can to go slow. That kids will start to lobby for social media access. Of course they will. They will often start to lobby for this at ages 8, 9, 10, depending on where you are in your community or what the values are around you. And what I want parents to know is you don't actually have to hand it over then, and you certainly don't have to hand it over all at once. It really matters to take a developmental view of digital technology with kids. And I can tell you, there are completely reasonable ways to provide a 10-year-old with an iPhone, if that is something that the child wants and that the parent wants. And sometimes the parent wants it too. But that iPhone should not have a browser, does not need social media apps. And I would say probably the greatest thing you can do at that moment is say to your kid, this never goes in your bedroom. That rule alone is incredibly powerful at keeping some guardrails around digital technology and later social media. And the beautiful thing is your 10-year-old will agree to it. They are so excited to get that device that they will agree in that moment. And it's actually a pretty easy rule to maintain and enforce if you start out with that. It's a harder rule to put in place once a teenager has taken a phone into their room. So think about it much more as a stepwise process. And all along the way, you get to see how your kid is managing. So if your young teenager has texting, which they often do, and I consider that a very good sort of beginner version of social media, handle it well, they stay in good touch with the people they know, they use it to build their friendships, you can feel more confident later on allowing some social media. If they end up in the meanest text thread ever, what they are basically skywriting is that they're not ready for social media. So I want to reassure parents. There will probably come a point late in adolescence where a teenager is on social media, is deeply engaged with it, and that's a big part of their life. It's much better for that to happen later in development than earlier, because as teenagers age, they also become more skeptical. Skepticism is a very good thing to have on board if you're going to be engaged with social media. And so go slow. Give them texting, maybe give them one app that you're monitoring closely, see how it goes, but push full engagement as far down the line as possible. I would say I want to see kids 14, 15 or older before they're really deep in.
Okay, very interesting. How do you see the development of adjusting to anxiety and technology between teenage girls, which you've written extensively about, especially in your book Under Pressure, and the anxiety that's there, and teenage boys? And how does that differ in the way that they deal with all these factors, and in how they can be coached to deal with them better?
So we do see differences by gender in terms of how kids engage the digital environment. Girls are more likely to be engaged socially to maintain their friendships and, stay up to date on what's happening socially over social media platforms than boys are. Boys are more likely to be engaged in gaming and use that often as a basis for their social interactions.
Okay.
We also see that girls can find themselves losing confidence if they spend a lot of time on social media environments that are very appearance-oriented or perfectionism-oriented. That said, we are seeing many more boys who are engaged in worrying about their bodies, ultra fitness, as a result, I think, of time spent online. The other thing that we're seeing, at least in the US, and this is anecdotal, but I'm hearing it enough that I'm willing to share it, is that boys can sometimes find themselves much more engaged in hate environments online. And so one of the things that parents need to be really, really attentive to, regardless of the gender of their teenager, is that the algorithms that drive social media platforms will pay very close attention to what a kid is interested in, or even what a kid kind of glances at or expresses a minor interest in, and then serve them a lot more of that content. So if your kid is using social media to look at sports clips or cat videos, you probably don't need to worry too much. If your kid is using social media to look at diet advice or online hateful content, you should definitely be aware and you'll want to intervene.
Overall, Lisa, I wanted you to help us understand how much the life of a teenager has changed from our time to current time. And I certainly remember spending a lot more time outside, having, I don't want to call them real experiences because digital experiences are real too, but certainly more social interactions. Do you think that the fact that teenagers' lives sometimes are, at least in the Western world and developed societies, in abundant societies, are just a lot more, how shall I say, easier, softer, because they don't have more real experiences? They're not thrown around like we used to be, maybe a little bit more outside. And is that unfair to say?
We want to be careful how we talk about teenagers, both because I love them and also because they are listening. And the truth about teenagers is they live up to expectations and down to them too. So if we talk about teenagers as though they are fragile or incapable, we run the risk of actually having teenagers meet us where we are, right? Talking about them, thinking about them in that way. One thing I can say about where teenagers are with regard to emotion right now is they are picking up the messages that everyone in our culture is getting, that negative emotions are bad, that you're supposed to feel happy and calm and relaxed. Adults are getting this message, kids are getting this message. It's not a very helpful message. It's not a very accurate message. I think it's often well-meaning, but not useful. And so teenagers, like their parents, are often more frightened of negative emotions than generations past, right? When you and I were growing up, if we were upset, our parents would likely be like, you'll get over it, right?
Yeah.
And it would help us to do so. We're in a whole environment, adults and kids, that are much more anxious about negative emotions than we used to be, and that has a downstream effect. The thing I will say, though, that is really different and that we want to be attentive to is what you're describing. It used to be the reality that with teenagers, you're almost trying to rein them in, right? That they were wanting to be out more. They were wanting to go do things. They were wanting to be out in the world. And like, how late can my curfew possibly be? Today's teenagers do stay closer to home. And part of it is that they can interact from home with so many people. Part of it is that the pandemic terrified everybody and teenagers were held home a lot, and that has made them more anxious about going out. But one of the things I am helping families with far more than in the past is that their teenagers are avoidant. Rather than sort of chomping at the bit to see how much they can be out and about in the world, parents are often feeling like they're needing to push their kid out of the nest a little bit. And that, I would say, especially accelerated in the pandemic when we were all so close to home for so long.
Something you've talked about extensively that I've heard and I wanted to get into a little bit is, how do you gauge when to engage with a teenager or not, right? When they're maybe not feeling themselves or not acting themselves. When do you try to pry? When do you give them space? When can you make something worse? How can you make something better? And it's so difficult, and especially as you said now, I mean, the topic of mental health is so present in everyday life, and obviously that's positive, but then you don't want to feed into the negative emotions too much at the same time, and then you don't want to ignore them as well and think, oh, this'll go, she'll be fine tomorrow. How do you navigate that? When you talk to teenagers, what do they tell you that they want?
Well, what they want is empathy. I can tell you that.
Okay. And not judgment, I guess. They don't want to be judged, right?
They don't want to be judged. When a teenager comes home and tells you about their bad day, you cannot go wrong if you just say, oh man, that stinks, or I'm sorry, or I wish that hadn't happened. That's what they want. That's what they deserve. That's usually all they need. But actually, one of the things that can be very helpful and strangely reassuring is to know exactly when you should be worried about your teenager, right? Their emotions are so big and powerful. So let me tell you when I want people to be worried about their teenagers. I want people to worry if a teenager's mood goes to a dark or concerning or paralyzed by anxiety place and stays there for 24 to 36 hours even is a long time in the life of a teenager. Normal mood in teenager goes up and down all day. We expect to see that. So I want you to worry if their mood doesn't go up and down and just stays down. I also want adults and caregivers to worry if a teenager is using what I call costly coping. So they're managing their feelings, but in a way that's going to come with a price tag. So they're upset and then they go get drunk. Or they're upset and they come home and they act awful to everybody else so that if I'm unhappy, we're all going to be unhappy. I'm not doing this alone, right? It may give them company, but it makes everybody miserable. Or they're upset and they collapse in on themselves. Why do all bad things happen to me? Nothing's ever going to go my way, in a language that starts to sound depressive. That's when I want you to worry about your teenager. If you're not seeing that, if you're seeing a kid whose mood is all over the place, sometimes they're happy, sometimes they're down, they want to play with their friends, they want to hide in their room a little while to recover from a bad day, that is almost always the rich and spicy business that is just being a typically developing teenager and not necessarily grounds for concern.
That hopefully that helps some of the parents out there who are struggling with this, because it's difficult. You don't want to do anything that hurts, but then you don't want to leave them alone. And we all draw on our own experiences too. And I keep thinking about, and we discussed it when we spoke before the interview, but there's this clip on social media that I've seen a bunch of times where you see how a kid reacts to bumping against a wall if they were born in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, ranging from the guy in the 70s that just bumps and kind of moves on, to the kid nowadays that bumps, makes a big scene, shoots themselves on social media reacting, and then you just don't know how seriously to take certain things. When it comes to talking about what kids are consuming and the way they see the world, and I wanted to mention extremism as well. And some studies show that young people today are less tolerant. They're more in favor of cancellation. What explains the attraction to extremism these days, in your view?
Well, one thing I would say is it's not just kids, right?
True.
We are watching
Very true.
them operate in an environment where the adults can be incredibly impatient with one another, incredibly interested in scoring points by pointing out other people's shortcomings as opposed to looking for shared solutions. That our teenagers are very much growing up in a universe we have created. And so they don't act that differently from the adults at times when they are engaged in pretty abrupt and unempathic responses to one another. They look like a lot of the grown-ups. But I will say for the teenagers, and this is something that's fascinating to me, they spend more time talking with or being near people who don't share their views than most adults do. As adults, we have our friends, we have our circles, we tend to be surrounded by people who think the way we think. When teenagers go to school, often they are in class with, or sharing a locker with, or eating lunch with, or in a lab partner group with somebody who sees the world very, very differently than they do. And they have to make it work a huge amount of the time, and they do make it work a huge amount of the time. And so it's fascinating to me that we can sometimes train our attention on how harsh teenagers can be with one another. I think that is what we see. I think we don't as often see how much time they spend accommodating and making room for people who see the world quite differently than they do.
And of course, their parents see the world very differently than they do as well, adding on to the colleagues and friends. What's the best advice or the advice that you think works best that you give young people on how to navigate all these different expectations, all these different standards that are around them, and be honest not only with themselves but with their environment? Because from my experience, what I've seen anyway, and what scares me when I think about my daughter one day is I want to know what's going on, right? I just want to know what's going on, whether it's good or bad. I want to know what's going on, regardless of the expectations that she thinks I have for her. I want to know if she's failing them, because then I can help her, right? And friends, it's the same thing. You want to know if people are doing well or not, regardless of what your expectations are for them. So what kind of advice do you give teenagers on how to deal with other people's expectations and not be scared to let them down and be honest with themselves and their environment?
So one thing I can say is that we want to help teenagers develop a strong moral compass and a strong sense of self. And part of how we do that is really by modeling. You know, teenagers watch us, and they watch how we make decisions, and they watch how we think about the kinds of questions you're asking. So a very powerful thing we can do is open, sort of pull back the veil. When we're having exactly the same kind of challenges that you're talking about in our own lives, which we do, maybe a colleague who says something that we find disagreeable, maybe somebody who holds us to a standard that feels unfair. Those are times actually in family life where we should talk about how we're navigating that ourselves, how it makes us feel, how it makes us want to act, how upon reflection we decide to act instead. One of my favorite pieces of parenting advice that I ever found was not actually meant to be parenting advice, but it was on the inside of a chocolate wrapper. And it said, don't talk about it, be about it. So all the things we want for our kids need to be how we're living our lives in front of them. Now, you raised another question about how do we help kids be honest with us about what's really happening, good or bad. And I will tell you, there's actually a secret trick here. And I'm really glad you're asking. And I'm really excited that you have a young person who will soon be a teenager, because they really are, well, not too soon, but soon enough. Be a teenager.
Soon enough, yeah.
Teenagers do something very clever to decide whether or not they want to share close to home information with us, which is they talk about dicey information involving their classmates. So they will come home and they will say, so, I heard that so-and-so was smoking back behind the school. Or, so, I heard that so-and-so was having sex, at this particular, concerning age. And then they will watch our reaction.
Mm.
And if we say, what? Oh my goodness, that is terrible. What's wrong with that child? They are taking that in and thinking, if I do something you're not going to like, this is not going to go well. If we say, that's so interesting, what do you think about that? In a gentle way, and get them to tell us what's on their mind, hold our judgment, make it clear that we understand that what they're sharing is important, but actually hold our judgment. And then say, gosh, I worry that kid isn't taking great care of themselves. I wonder what's getting in the way of them caring for themselves. You are in real time creating an environment that basically has the rules of, I'm interested in kids. I understand that kids do things they should not do. I will withhold judgment and not make it about character or some, immutable aspect of that kid. And I'm here to help. So the first time your kid starts talking about what other kids are up to, that is your golden opportunity to tell the story of how it will go when your kid shares things that you may not want to hear about themselves.
Yeah. Never thought of that. Thanks so much for sharing that as well. As always, we end all our conversations and interviews with some quick fire questions to everyone. I'm going to add one here on the fly to you to kind of make a link into these. What's the thing that inspires you the most about today's teenagers that maybe you didn't see it in your time? What's the most inspirational behavior or aspect of teenagers today that surprises you or impresses you the most?
So as much as we can be anxious about social media and digital technology and what it means for teenagers, it also means they are so much more broadly engaged with the world, aware of what's happening, argumentation at very sophisticated levels that we're nowhere near where we were when we were in high school, right? I mean, they are way ahead of us. So they are aware that we're engaged. They are sophisticated often in their assessment of situations, and they are hopeful often about what can be done to try to make things better.
Okay, perfect way for us to link into our quick fire questions. So just one word or one sentence to answer these, please. So what is one personality trait that in your opinion a good leader could really benefit from having?
Humility.
Humility, okay. What is the biggest challenge that humanity faces today in your view, and why?
Empathy for one another. And why? I mean, we have just come to a place where people are very entrenched in their viewpoint and really are struggling to see things from somebody else's position.
If you could change one thing by magic in your environment, what would that be?
I worry about the climate. I would magically fix the climate.
Yeah, that comes up a lot. It's a good sign because people are thinking about it. It's a bad sign because it's bad. And
There's no magic.
Yeah. And finally, what is the most important learning of your life and career?
That most of the time, you get the outcomes you want through effort, not through luck, not through hope, but through work.
Lisa, look, I absolutely loved this conversation. I've certainly learned so much. Thank you for sharing your experience, your insight with us. And I'm sure that parents in Portugal and beyond that listen to this conversation will also get a lot of content here. Go back and take notes, because I think it's the kind of thing that is needed. It's not easy, but you broke down so much that doesn't seem that simple into terms that I think can be digested and appreciated. So thank you so much for your time and for your knowledge sharing as well.
Thank you for having me. A real honor.
An absolute pleasure to speak with Lisa Damour, and so much to take away from this conversation. Really hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. And It's not easy to be a parent overall. Teenage years comes up all the time as perhaps the toughest period to be able to navigate. So hopefully there's some tools here that we can all use to make it easier. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you following another episode. See you again soon.